Earlier this year, I decided that I needed to get a medium format camera of my own. Luckily for me, a friend of mine was looking to sell his Bronica SQ-AI. I had the opportunity to shoot with this camera last year and frankly loved doing it, and also this friend of mine was offering a pretty sweet deal that I just couldn't turn down. So I went ahead and put my money where my mouth was. I bought the camera. Bronica was founded in 1958 and initially sourced lenses from Nikon for its cameras. The modular design of the Bronica SLR cameras allowed for interchangeable components like lenses, bodies, film backs, and viewfinders. These cameras were popular among wedding, portrait, and amateur photographers. Over the years, Bronica introduced its own lenses and continued to refine its SLR models in various film roll formats. The Bronica SQ is a medium format SLR camera that replaced the Bronica EC in August of 1980. The SQ-A, released in 1982, added mirror lockup and auto exposure. The SQ-AM, introduced in 1983, is a motor drive only version of the SQ-A. And finally, the SQ-AI, announced in 1990, added the ability to use a motor drive, OTF metering, and TTL automatic flash. It also introduced a longer shutter speed of 16 seconds, a bulb mode, and an increased ISO range up to 6400. Now, let's take a look at all the bells and whistles on this camera and find out how to use it. Let's start here on the left side of the camera. First, we could see the lens release. Then we see the shutter speed dial with speeds from bulb and 16 seconds to 1/500th of a second in one-stop increments. Also on this side, we have the cable release socket and PC flash sync. And finally, on the bottom right, a button that releases the film back. Now, the camera that I got is actually missing the dark slide, so the film back is sort of permanently affixed to the camera body until I find a dark slide. My film back release button doesn't actually work. I can't press it in to remove the back. And oddly, finding a dark slide for an SQ-AI is harder than it may sound. So if anyone knows where I can get one, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Moving on to the right side, we find the viewfinder release. Now, my camera came with this prism viewfinder, and there are others that you can get, like a waist level finder, but personally, I really love using this thing. Speaking of the viewfinder, it took me way too long to discover how to use the light meter on mine. By pressing the silver button on the side, I get either a plus or minus or just right indicator to tell me if my exposure is correct. One thing to note about this is I always try to make sure that the shutter speed on the camera body itself and on the viewfinder, the prism viewfinder, are exactly the same, just to ensure that the shutter is firing at the correct speed. I've gotten back shots that were underexposed because maybe, let's say, the camera body shutter speed said that it was shooting at 1/500th of a second, and the prism viewfinder shutter speed dial said it was shooting at 1/60th of a second. And I guess the connections between the prism viewfinder and the camera might not always work 100% of the time, so sometimes the exposures can be a little bit off. But that could just be me doing something wrong on my end. Again, let me know in the comments if you have more information. But anyway, let's get back to the side of the camera. We see another two switches, one for multiple exposures and another one for mirror lockup. To make multiple exposures, rotate the film winding crank and turn the multiple exposure lever clockwise, which will expose the red mark. When set in this position, the shutter can be released and cocked any number of times without advancing the film. When set for multiple exposures, a black square with a round cutout will appear in the right front area of the focusing screen, or the left side if you're looking in the prism viewfinder. Just don't forget when you complete the multiple exposed picture to be sure to return the multiple exposure lever back to its vertical position and cover the red mark. Otherwise, there will be additional multiple exposures on the same frame. The mirror lockup lever has three settings, N, S, and C. N stands for normal. S stands for single frame. And C stands for continuous. For shooting with the mirror locked up, first you cock the shutter, then you rotate the mirror lockup lever. The lens shutter will close completely, and the reflex mirror and film safety plate will swing up. Now, the difference between the S and C setting is that when the S is set, the lever will automatically return to the normal setting with the next film advance. When C is set, the lever will not return to its normal setting with the next film advance. Therefore, shooting with a mirror locked up will be possible any number of times. You could use this for low shutter speed photos or when you're taking long exposures. Moving on, we have the shutter release button with the locking ring. Finally, we have the film advance winding crank. On the bottom of the camera is where we load the 4 LR44 batteries that will power the camera. I'm personally very glad that this camera uses LR44 batteries and not something that's a little bit more difficult to find. I recently just bought a 50 pack of LR44 batteries on Amazon for like $10, so I don't think I'm going to be running out anytime soon. Also on the bottom we have the tripod socket and some connections to use with a speed grip accessory. On the film back we have the ISO speed dial, the frame counter, and the manual film winder for loading the film. Now there are different types of film backs you can get for this camera, whether it be a 645 film back or Polaroid or 220 or 35mm. When you press the electromagnetic shutter release button with the ball of your finger, a red colored LED will light up in the viewfinder momentarily and will indicate that the exposure has been completed when the shutter is released. The camera is equipped with a microprism split image rangefinder spot in the center of the focusing screen. The central split image spot splits the image in two, with the upper and lower halves separated horizontally when the lens is out of focus, and when in focus, the two will coincide with the displacement disappearing. The lens shutter on S and PS series lenses have an X setting for flash synchronization, which means that electronic flash units will synchronize at all shutter speed settings up to the fastest 1/500th of a second. The lenses have a leaf shutter, a depth of field preview switch, and the ability to shoot in T or time mode. The Bronica SQ-AI added a bulb mode, but this is only recommended for exposures that don't go over a minute since it needs power to function and that will eat your batteries really quick. The solution is to use the T mode in the lenses. Once enabled, it will keep the shutter open for as long as you want until you put it back to A mode. So everyone knows that the weight of your camera system is really important, and the Bronica is not necessarily a light system. I mean, it's certainly lighter than, say, a Mamiya RB67, but then again, so is my car. Just keep in mind that if you're trying to save your back, like me, someone who has reached the ripe old age of 27, carrying this camera with its accessories, maybe an extra lens, on top of maybe having a 35mm camera in a backpack that you're taking on a hiking trip, things are going to get pretty heavy pretty quick. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons of this camera. Up first, let's talk about modularity. Whether we're talking film backs, viewfinders, grips, focusing screens, you name it, there are a ton of accessories for this camera system. Now let's talk about lenses. These lenses are very, very sharp. Now I'm rocking the 80mm and the 50mm S series. I've been told that the PS series is actually a little bit sharper than the S series. I haven't tested any of the PS lenses, so I can't confirm or deny that, but these lenses are very, very sharp, and there are a lot of them out there in the world. Another pro is that you could use flash sync at any speed. This is honestly a great feature. As someone who uses a lot of flash photography when doing portrait work, I'm excited to actually test this out here in my studio when doing some portraits. Up next, the fact that it supports metered viewfinders is honestly a game changer. When I discovered that I could use the light meter on this camera just by pressing this little silver button here, it honestly changed everything, because now I can go out just with this camera and I don't have to lug around another camera or a light meter or use a cell phone app, which I'm a little wary of. I don't usually trust those apps too much. Another pro that I'll mention is that the viewfinder is very, very bright. Whether you have the prism finder attached or the waist level finder, or you're just looking right at the focusing screen with nothing attached at all, it is bright. You're going to be able to see what you're doing. Maybe in the daylight without the prism finder, it's going to be a little bit harder because you're getting light from all angles. But in a dark studio with all the light in one direction, you should be able to see pretty well in the focusing screen at whatever you're looking at. And now, while I mentioned that it is heavy, it's not that heavy. So that is sort of a pro in my mind. It is not the heaviest medium format camera out there by far. And this one's a little less important, but I'll do it anyway because people love to hear the sound of a shutter. The sound of this shutter is very, very satisfying. So here, let me do it for you. Yeah, that goes hard. Alright, let's move on to the cons of this camera. The first one is the need for batteries. This will always be a con for me just because of the constant fear and anxiety that one day the electronics are just going to go kaput. Another con is I feel like this camera is a little bit more complicated than I would like. Certainly a beginner could pick it up and learn it pretty quick, but there are a lot of bells and whistles on here that make it a little bit harder to learn than something like the Mamiya RB67 or a 35mm camera like the Pentax K1000. When I first got this camera, it took me a little while to get to use it, and I'm someone who's used a lot of cameras, and honestly, still to this day, I'm discovering new things about this camera, which could be a pro. I mean, it's got a lot of features, but it is also a little bit, has more of a learning curve if you're a beginner getting into medium format photography. Also, this camera is not very ergonomic to hold without either a grip attachment that you can get for it. Just holding it on its own, let me show you. I don't really like the sort of square design. I know a lot of people do. A lot of medium format cameras are this way. But then again, this camera was made primarily for studio use or just to be used on a tripod for landscape photography. And so I can't really fault the camera for that. This isn't meant to be a street photography camera, so the fact that it isn't ergonomic isn't really a fault of the camera, it's more so just of my expectations. And the last con that I could think of is the 6x6 square format of this camera. But then again, this camera system does offer film backs that have 645 and allow you to get 15 frames instead of the 12 frames that you get with 6x6. So again, it's not really a fault of the camera because it does offer other sizes and formats, but the 6x6 format is not really my favorite, although I feel like I've been warming up to it lately. And there you have it. That's just about everything you need to know about the Bronica SQ-AI. Let me know in the comments if there is anything that I left off that you think is really important for anyone getting this camera for the first time to know. I have absolutely loved shooting with this camera. I feel like it unlocked this dormant creativity within me in the last few months. You could probably tell if you watch my photo recap videos, this camera plays a big part in a lot of those videos. I just think the images that I get out of this thing are fantastic, and while it does have a lot of bells and whistles, I don't think it's unfathomable for a beginner to pick this thing up and start making photos that they're really proud of. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified when new videos are released. Go ahead and find that join button, and for a couple bucks a month, you could become a member and help this channel grow into the future. You could hit me up on Instagram, send me a DM, let me know if there's any questions you have or ideas you have for future videos. And also head over to my print shop where you could find prints of my work. Consider buying one. Some of them have been taken on this very camera, the Bronica SQ-AI, and on that note, I'm going to leave this video off with a bunch of photos that I took with this camera so you could see the full potential of it. And with that, I'll see you all next time.